Dear colleagues, dear speakers, dear guests, I'm really glad to see such a large and diverse group here gathering today for our discussion on the war in Ukraine and the religious aspects, especially with regard to international relations. Many thanks also to the KNAW, the Dutch Academy for the Sciences, who hosts this evening today. Many thanks to our speakers who were willing to join us at a fairly short term. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Professor Beatrice de Graaf from Utrecht University, had to excuse herself due to problems with internet connection. She's abroad and very much had wanted to be here tonight, but wasn't able to make it happen. Luckily, we have found Professor Alfons Brüning from Radboud University willing not to come up with a full presentation, but to offer some comments and reflections on the earlier presentations of our three speakers of tonight, Professor Evert van der Zweerde, Dr. Michael Bakker, and Professor Kristina Stoeckl. I hardly need to remind you that the war in Ukraine is still in full force, though it no longer hits the headlines every day, although today again, the tragic evacuation of Mariupol was making headlines in the Dutch and the international newspapers again. The religious aspects of this war have been relatively well covered, partly because they have been so prominently used by Russia in the public role of Patriarch Kirill in the ideological or theological underpinning of the war, and by the religious and apocalyptic language of President Putin himself. But also by the way in which in Ukraine religion has been used as a way to undergird Ukrainian nationalism that motivates resistance to the Russian invasion. In both countries, it is especially the various expressions of orthodoxy that are particularly important in this, with conflicting interpretations of what orthodoxy is and of its history in Russia and Ukraine. Our panel tonight will address various aspects of both the history and the current situation from their respective expertise. And I'll start by introducing Professor Evert van der Zweerde, who holds a chair in social and political philosophy at the Faculty of Philosophy, Theology and Religious Studies at Radboud University. Professor van der Zweerde has published widely on Russian political philosophy and makes him an excellent introducer of the topic for tonight. I mentioned just one of his books, an edited volume with Dr. Agajanian and Jödeke on religion, nation and democracy in the South Caucasus, which was published in 2015. And before I give the floor to Professor Evert van der Zweerde, I'll just remind you, especially those who are joining via the webinar, that questions can be asked via the Q&A button. And you can start, in fact, putting in questions there right now after we've gotten started. So we will have a discussion session after the four speakers have presented, and then we'll have ample time for a more general discussion via the questions that you are asking. But if there's any questions right now, just put them in the chat, in the Q&A, and then we might be able to answer some of them already before we get to the general discussion. So I think this is the right time to give the floor to Professor Evert van der Zweerde.
Thank you very much, Heleen, for your introduction. As you can see, I'm working at Radboud University, and in the first slide, which is sort of an introductory one, I put two items. One is a book that I recently finished, which is on Russian political philosophy, but that's just as a matter of advertising. But the other one is a picture that tells you that Russia is a country to be loved, which is something that may sound very strange today, and which even to me is sounding strange, and also a cause of let's say, internal conflict. I will start my presentation with this notion. I've been to Russia more than 40 times, including for longer periods. And there are many things about Russian culture, language, the people, the food, etc., that I'm very much attached to, which makes this whole war in Ukraine a tragedy on many levels, including the personal level. So I'd like the moderator to go to the first and also last slide, the next one. Martina, if you can. I don't see the next slide yet. Yeah, and then the first line. So I want to talk about the war in Ukraine, and as Heleen said in the beginning, this will be an introduction. I will not say that much about religion, not because I don't find religion interesting or relevant in this case, but because other speakers will have plenty to say about that. I want to offer you a few reflections, a little bit of food for thought before we start addressing this issue, and especially before we start judging. I think that one of the things that trouble us today is that there are many possible perspectives on the topic at hand, the war in Ukraine. And if Martina, if you can open the next line. The first one, which I called number 0, because I will not really address it, is the level of moral outrage. And I think there's not a need to say much about that. I think that what Russia has been doing and is doing in Ukraine is beyond any moral standard. I think there's no justification for this invasion, and especially not for the brutality with which it is being executed, including the brutality of the Russian army with respect to its own military personnel, by the way. So I think that from a moral perspective, the case is crystal clear in a way, apart from the fact that, of course, we all are against war, generally, I think. But we should bear in mind that not everybody in the world is against war, and that will take me to the next topic. And in what I try to do in my work is to understand things from their own causes. So that is not the same as justifying anything, but it is trying to understand why things are the way they are. What I want to address first is what I would call reductionism or vulgarism, and which is what I generally reject, and in this case especially. It's often called realism, and it comes in two interconnected kinds. The first one is what you might call geopolitical realpolitik. So that is what experts in military history tell us. It's what experts in international relations tend to tell us. And we get ideas like the traditional fear, Russia's traditional fear of encirclement, which now is, of course, one of the reasons why they are doing what they are doing. They are perceived encirclement, right? The second one is, of course, the issue of Crimea. We can start a long discussion there, but I will not say too much about that. And the third one is the expansion of the NATO and of the European Union in an eastward direction. Now, what I do want to say about this is that this is, of course, a relevant element of this whole situation that needs to be taken into account. I think that politics can never be based on historical claims. If you would discuss historical claims on Crimea, you would probably have to go back to the ancient Greeks or the Scythians or one of the many peoples that were populating that area, or the Tatars. And then, of course, there is this whole debate about how Crimea became part of Ukraine in the first place by mistake, according to the Kremlin, and there is a grain of truth in that. Just as there is a grain of truth in the idea that NATO and the European Union have been expanding eastward against Russia's protests, and in a period when Russia was not in a position to do anything about that. So that's one sort of reductionism. The other sort of reductionism is what you might call economic reductionism, the reduction of this whole conflict to economic interest. Oil and gas, of course, which is a very complicated issue right now. Today, the European Union is discussing the possibility of a boycott of Russian oil and gas. And I think we have to be realistic there and say that in a globalized economy, any country that buys oil and gas from any other country is by definition complicit in the wars that that other country is waging. And that is very sad news right now, because it pushes us back in a way to the idea of autarky and away from globalization. That can be a good thing or a bad thing, but I think it will have heavy consequences on even on our daily life. Second, there is, of course, the issue of lithium. Donbass is very rich in lithium, and lithium is one of the minerals of the present, but certainly of the future when it comes to energy transition. So I think that if we replace Gazprom by Litprom, we will not have a much better world. And finally, of course, there's arms trade. And I said just a minute ago that not everybody is against war. One of the groups in world society that is not against war is the large number of arms trade companies and the countries that sell arms and that want to see them tested in real war theaters. And that might even include tactical weapons, tactical nuclear weapons. I think many people in the world are very curious to know what happens when you use one of those weapons. And I think that in some parts of the world, ministers of defense are eagerly watching this whole thing and to see what kind of weaponry they might want to buy in the future. That takes me to the next topic, which is the other pitfall that I think we should avoid, not because it's irrelevant, but because it's not the whole truth, which is what I would call idealism. That's a focus on ideas or on theories, including perhaps also religion, which also comes in two kinds. And the first kind is the idea that there is some kind of ideology behind what the current administration in the Kremlin is doing. Sometimes this is called Putinism or Putin's philosophy. A few years ago, there was a book. I hope that it is visible. I can sort of see it in the camera, which was published by a French philosopher, Michel Elchaninov, who has Russian roots, obviously, Dans la tête de Vladimir Putin. It was translated into German, into English, and it discusses what books from the Russian philosophical history Vladimir Putin might have read or that might have been relevant or influential on his thinking. I think that this influence is likely to be rather superficial, but that doesn't mean that these thinkers, they were Ivan Ilyin, Vladimir Solovyov, and Nikolai Berdyaev, that their names and their ideas do not ring bells in many minds in Russia or in the former Soviet Union more broadly. I think when it comes to Putin himself, we are talking more about an idea of nostalgic revenge, the idea of strong statehood, which is central to the Kremlin's discourse since the beginning of this century, the sense of humiliation that has been very strong in the post-Soviet part of the world, especially in post-Soviet Russia, the idea that Russia was being betrayed by the West, that it didn't get what it deserved, that it had been humiliated, and there is a sense of taking revenge on this. And finally, and not least importantly, I think there is a clear need for an enemy, and this not only on the Russian side, but also on the Western side. For a while, this new common enemy in the 1990s was found in terrorism, especially Islamist terrorism, but now there is a clear enemy again, and I think, as I said, this is not only not only a Russian phenomenon, but also a Western phenomenon, and there is a kind of rallying around the flag. That takes me to the second point. This rallying around the flag is often clad from the Russian side or supported by a number of grand narratives, and of course these narratives are partly overlapping. I'll mention three of them, but there are certainly more. One is, and you could also call them Russian ideas, which is a very old notion in Russian philosophy, that there is such a thing as a Russian idea, which is then usually read as God having an idea of Russia's destiny or Russia's mission in this world. The first is the idea of a Ruski Mir. An idea that is basically territorial, that is based on the former Russian Empire, the Tsarist Empire, and that includes the notion of a Novorossiya, which you already find on old maps, including Dutch maps from the beginning of the previous century. You will find Novorossiya as an indication of the area roughly that Russia right now is trying to occupy, or as they would see it, regain. Secondly, and I think that Kristina will say more on that, so I will be very brief, there's the idea of the Orthodox world, which is spread especially by the current Patriarch, Kirill, and which bears a certain similarity to the ideas of the late Samuel Huntington, the idea that the world is populated by a number of civilizations based ultimately on religious difference. And third, there is the idea of Eurasianism, propagated especially by Alexander Dugin and his so-called fourth political theory, which, philosophically speaking, is based on a right Heideggerian position, but which has broad support not only in Russia but also outside in the European and the in the American right wing. There's a lot of affinities and a lot of communication also between right-wing people, right-wing thinkers in Europe and the United States and somebody like Dugin. These three grand narratives, Ruski Mir, the world of orthodoxy, and Eurasian civilization, are largely what Germans would call flächendeckend. So they cover the same, more or less the same territory, not completely, but largely, and they are all of them anti-liberal, anti-individualistic, anti-hedonistic, and that is part of the discourse that they spread. An example of that is something that was in one of the Dutch daily newspapers last Saturday. I'll hold up the picture. This is a picture of, I hope you should be able to see it. It's a picture of two people who recently fled from Russia and who have applied for asylum in the Netherlands. It's a non-binary couple who in Russia are identified as part of the LGBTIQA+ community. They have the same name, so they are called Chloe Kusia Queen. So they both have the same name and they don't distinguish between their gender. And they are precisely an example of the kind of thing that this grand narrative, in fact, all three grand narratives, I think, do not want to have in Russia. They see it as an exponent par excellence of this liberal, hedonistic, individualistic frame. That takes me to the next topic, number 3. So I think that a realist perspective on the situation in Russia and on this war in Ukraine is and should be a combination of the two just mentioned. On the one hand, the geopolitical and economic factors, but at the same time, taking seriously the ideas that are spread in the mind of Putin, but also the people around him, and these grand narratives that all of them do resonate with parts of the Russian population. Takes me to the next point. So I think that first of all, there is the issue, it's an outdated, according to some perhaps, the notion of ideology. I think that especially the grand narratives are used as a legitimization, sincerely or not. So this is irrespective of people's subjective conviction or belief or something like that. They legitimize the other factors. So they legitimize the idea of a strong state and also the geopolitical and economic interests. Next one, please. Secondly, I think we should be realistic. There is a culture war raging. There is a war between, on the one hand, this liberal individualism, and on the other hand, let's say the traditional family values. But it's important to bear in mind that this front line in this culture war, if you like, or you could also call it a political war or a war between value systems, the front line between those two positions does not coincide with the front line between Russia on the one hand and NATO or the Western Europe and its allies on the other hand. The front line of this culture war runs across countries. And if you look at a country like France, you will see this front line run right across society. But even I think if you look at highly liberal and secular societies, so-called secular societies like the Netherlands, you will see that a significant part of the population is not really happy with this. Let me hold up the picture again with people like this. I think many people are not feeling comfortable about this thing. But my point is that these two wars seemingly now are identified. They are equated as if there is a single front line. And by the way, that is a return to old-time Soviet rhetoric, the war on two fronts, the political front, the military front, if you like, and the ideological front. That takes me to the last point. So I think that the the interests, they also fit this idea of a strong state. And I think in that sense, there's one dimension that we should never forget or overlook, which is that this war is also about the domestic situation in Russia. It's the final blow to any kind of political opposition in Russia. Roughly 300,000 people, probably more by now, have left Russia because they are against this war. That, of course, is a significant brain drain because it's mostly people working at universities, artists, etc. So it's also the creative people in Russia, the people of the future. But it's also a protest drain. It's also the people who are against this war, who are left to go, let's say. And finally, it's also a loss of generation, I think, in the long run. But that is something that Russia will have to deal with. That takes me to a final statement, which is that I think, and I go back here to my love of Russia or my affinity with Russia, that we should never confuse a regime with its population. And there's a parallel there between the war in Ukraine and the war in Vietnam, which took place when I was a schoolboy. And in both cases, I think it is important to make that distinction, and at this point in time, not to demonize Russians, especially not the Russians who are residing in Europe. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Evert, for this excellent brief introduction into the various ways of looking at this war, the possible causes, and especially your kind of the end with discussing the internal issues in Russia as a very important aspect to keep in mind. We move to Professor Kristina Stoeckl. She holds a chair in Religionssociologie und Soziale und Politische Theorie mit Schwerpunkt Russland und orthodoxes Christentum at the Institute for Sociology at the University of Innsbruck. I think we've met briefly a long time ago. She has done a very interesting ERC. I think it's almost finished, an ERC project which was entitled Post-Secular Conflicts, and which addressed some of the issues that Evert already referred to, the way in which Russian Orthodoxy deals with possible or conceived differences in the West and the East. So we are very happy that she could join us tonight. I think, Kristina, your book is almost out, or is already out, on which is called The Moralist International, if you want to say a few words about that.
Yes.
So Kristina, go ahead.
Okay,
Thank you for being here. Yeah.
So thank you, Heleen, for the introduction. Thank you very much, Evert, for your excellent presentation that really covered everything. So it gives me the possibility to just focus on one part of all of this, and that's the culture war story. And maybe I should add at this point that Evert was my second supervisor for my PhD. So we've reconnected since, but it's nice to reconnect also in this webinar. I'm using the chat function in order to send to what I believe is all of you a link to the book Heleen just mentioned. This is a book I've co-authored with my Russian colleague Dmitry Uslana, The Moralist International, Russia and the Global Culture Wars. And it brings together the most important findings from the ERC project, Post-Secular Conflicts. So I basically want to do two things in this brief presentation. Briefly explain to you what we say when we say that Russia is a player in the global culture wars. And second, what does this have to do with a broader theory of post-secular society or political theologies? Now, I think it's really important to repeat the point that Evert made, namely that the war in Ukraine has acquired in a kind of double sense of conflict. It's a military conflict between Russia and Ukraine, or from the Russian side, it's between Russia and the West, NATO, and it's a spiritual conflict, as expressed in the sermon given by Patriarch Kirill on the 6th of May, where he said that the Donbass is really the area where the forces of evil and the forces of good clash. And he said, so it's the liberal order, that that has a test that people have to pass in order to be part of the liberal world, and that's the holding of gay parades. And he basically, the argument basically was that the invasion of Ukraine, he talked particularly about the Donbass, the invasion of that area was necessary in order to protect Orthodox Christians there from being subjected to that alien civilization and these alien values, which would ultimately also lead to them straying from the righteous path. So it's a question of salvation. It's a question of religious salvation in a religious spiritual sense. Now, what interested me much before the war has started, and I have to say that among those who didn't see it coming, but what we did see coming is that the Russian Orthodox Church was increasingly speaking in the terminology of the global culture wars, of a conflict between liberal values and conservative Christian values, very much focused on questions of the reproductive family, homosexuality, and religious freedom. And so what we have been doing in that book was basically trying to reconstruct the pathway of the Moscow Patriarchate from being an outsider to culture war conflicts as we knew them from the US, described already for the 80s by James Davis and Hunter in his book Culture Wars, The Struggle to Define America. So the pathway of the Russian Orthodox Church from being an outsider to these conflicts, to becoming an insider to these conflicts, to becoming a party, a player in the global culture wars. The fact that the American culture wars, this opposition between progressive social values and conservative social values epitomized around the question of abortion, pro-choice, pro-life, or reproductive family, gay marriage, not gay marriage. These struggles have been described, as I said, for the US already in the literature. And the literature is also described, also the IR literature, that these culture wars, the American culture wars, have become global. They've been carried up on a different political level, on the level of the United Nations, and in the EU on the level of the European Court of Human Rights. So these issues around controversial morality politics have left the national and also the confessional terrain and have become part of an international policy making and international transnational social movements. But it's still true that for a long time, the Orthodox world, not only Russia, but the Orthodox world in a way was not so much part of that. For the simple reason that until fairly recently, the main front line for conservative Orthodox thinkers was the West. It was a struggle with the West. And there was not much openness to seeing that the West itself is deeply internally divided. And it's the learning process about these deep divisions inside Western societies that we, in a way, describe and reconstruct as the process of Russia becoming a player in the global culture wars. And we do that as sociologists. So we tried really to get a hand on how that learning process happens, on how Russian Orthodox actors, how activists become drawn into culture war policies and mechanisms. And we looked at several institutions. One of them was the World Congress of Families, an international non-governmental organization, which was founded with Russian participation, has continued to function with Russian participation, and has slowly made had progress from being a largely academic and civil society agenda and undertaking to becoming a part of the agenda of the Moscow Patriarchate. So we give that example of the work congress of families in the book. We also give an example of homeschooling. We give the example of how the first anti-abortion groups were created inside the Russian Orthodox world. And all of these examples show that Russia has become a player in the global culture wars. It has become a party in the divisions between social conservatism and social progressivism. There's a very clear understanding that this is a conflict that runs deep right through Western societies. And for this reason, Russian players have become active and able to exploit these differences. And I have to say that this is something I did not see coming that much. And now I want to, in a way, maybe come to the point of February, March, and my realization that Russia, the Moscow Patriarch with his rhetoric, has once and for all weaponized the culture wars. So James Davison Hunter, the author of the book Culture Wars, his follow-up book to Culture Wars had the title Before the Shooting Begins. And he had a very clear sense of anxiety that culture wars in American society could lead to situations of civil war. And when he referred to the shooting, he meant shootings that did happen in the US, for example, attacks on abortion clinics in the US. So this was the sense of shooting he meant. And I think the degree of weaponization of cultural war arguments we see now in this context, in the war in Ukraine, through what has been said and brought forward as arguments by representatives of the Russian Orthodox Church is really very striking. And it is the more striking since they are directed against a country, Ukraine, which largely shares conservative traditional family values, probably shares them much more than Russia. The numbers we have on active churchgoers, on people expressing that their religion is important in their life, are much higher in Ukraine than they are in Russia. The Istanbul Convention was not ratified 3 times in the parliament in Kiev. It took 3 iterations in order to get it ratified, because parties didn't want it, because there was a broad consensus that they don't want the Istanbul Convention, they don't want debate about gender, about family violence, and so and whatsoever. So Ukraine is an example for a social conservative Orthodox country, against which now this weaponized culture war rhetoric of Russia is turning with devastating results and in a great paradox of events. Now, I want to end by asking, so what does all of this really have to do with ideas of post-secular society, political theologies? I think as sort of philosophers of religion and sociologists of religion, it shouldn't surprise us that we have religious traditions that take a stance on modernity that is, oppositional, that reject modernity. Religious fundamentalism is a fact. It's not something that we should be surprised that it exists. But what I think we should be asking ourselves, what is the interesting question, is how these attitudes and stances are articulated. And here I want to, in a way, echo what Evert said and about his love for Russia, which I share, and which has carried my enthusiasm for studying this country and religion in this country for so many years and almost decades already, is that Russian Orthodoxy is a multivariate, multivocal phenomenon. There are many ways in which the Russian Orthodox Church, after the end of the Soviet Union, could go. And we know the ways in which this church could have gone. I myself studied the works of religious dissidents in the late Soviet period, or people who never really called themselves dissidents, but had an oppositional thought, that were maybe more open to ideas of democracy, maybe not necessarily more open on social values and morality issues, but certainly more open on democracy. There are many voices inside the Russian Orthodox Church that have been silenced, that have not been heard. The tradition itself is rich, and we now see it being narrowed down to a culture war rhetoric. And now this is the important point, that is not entirely of its own making. It's a repetition of a global construction of what is the Christian right, what are social values. The Patriarch today doesn't speak in any terminology that is rooted in Orthodox Russian history tradition. He speaks about gay parades and about the necessity to struggle against liberal values. That's a choice of rhetoric that owes more to the global culture wars and American Christian right to any real debates or any real experience lived on the ground. So I think this is maybe the most important point I wanted to make, that by making that argument on the 6th of March, Patriarch Kirill has weaponized the culture wars, has used a language that is not entirely of his own making. Okay, I'll finish here. I'll allow myself to share one more link with you to an op-ed that I co-authored with Dimitrios Lana again for the Washington Post, where we briefly summarize what we draw out of this book on the situation in Ukraine. So thank you very much, and I look forward to answering more questions.
Thank you so much, Kristina, for this further kind of elucidation of what indeed these culture wars are and how this weaponization really changed the discussion. And I think that makes a great connection to the next discussant of today, Dr. Michael Bakker, who is one of the scholars at the Orthodox seminary at the Radboud University, St. Irenaeus Orthodox Seminary. He's the rector of that seminary also, but he's also a parish priest at the Orthodox parish in Amsterdam, the parish that made it to the headlines when they decided to transfer their allegiance to the ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople after Kirill had univocally declared his support for the war. So he definitely represents the perspective of those who have other views of orthodoxy than maybe we start to think if we only listen to Kirill. So he will discuss today the relations between church and state in Ukraine, Russia, and the Netherlands in the light of the war. Please take the floor, Dr. Bakker.
Thank you, Heleen. I will start sharing my screen, the PowerPoint presentation I have. I hope it is now visible, and I will start it.
It's okay. Yeah.
Yes, it's okay. Oh, thank you. Then I will start. First of all, I have to say I normally don't write about these matters. I'm well in the first millennium with my work, so for me this is academically an area which I normally don't touch upon, and I was basically thrown into the war as an actor because of the events that took place in Amsterdam. So I want to say something about that and my experience with the relations between church and state in the Netherlands, and what of course I observed in Russia and the Moscow Patriarchate, of which I was a member 37 years. Let me first start with what happened, but maybe not all the viewers know it. That was world news. The latest article was in the Independent, latest interview we gave, and I think it's now enough about the events in Amsterdam. But let me now briefly tell you what exactly happened, so to speak, first-hand knowledge. The war broke out. And me and my fellow clergy in Amsterdam were, of course, appalled by what was happening, but even more appalled by the silence of the head of our church, Patriarch Kirill. He didn't speak out. He didn't say anything. So we signed a statement together with other clergy in Russia. There was of course, no reply. And then later on also signed a statement as clergy in Amsterdam. Well, this precipitated new events because our then bishop, he came over unannounced and sort of wanted to exert the influence of Moscow. And actually he said that more or less, Moscow is watching you. So this felt like a threat, and this was also felt as a threat by the Dutch authorities, and for both of us, unacceptable interference by Moscow, so to speak. So then things moved rapidly. We asked to be transferred to the Patriarchate of Constantinople. The church has procedures for this. And in the meantime, we were attacked from other sides as well. Here you see the picture of the Z symbol. It's like a swastika, but putting a swastika on a synagogue, for us, it felt very threatening. There were other threats about which I won't say anything because we kept some things out of the news. But the result was that our church was closed for 4 weeks. Well, and this brings me to let's say, the relation with the state. In order to support us, we got a visit by our Minister of Justice and Security, and just to express her support. And I was, of course, glad to tell her that we really felt protected by her people, so by the police and other authorities. And there you see an example of how state and church can work together and still preserve the division between state and church. This was also echoed by the mayor of Amsterdam, who also came to visit us and had a message from even the royal couple. So something about the relation between state and church, how this functions, is something also first-hand knowledge, is that the Orthodox in Holland, in the Netherlands, or now with almost 250,000, they're busy in a process of emancipation. And a part of that is also taking the role in, for instance, the prison system, because the prisoners have a right to spiritual care. And this becomes even more important when you think of the possibility that that people will be judged in the Netherlands. And if these are Orthodox people, they have a right to spiritual care. So this has to be organized, and that's why in the Netherlands and other countries, of course, the state and the various religions have to cooperate. Well, here is in below to the right, you see the 8 denominations that are presently working together with the Dutch state, and all of them are minorities right now. And this is minorities, to deal with minorities, to respect minorities, I think is a very important aspect of what is going on, that even the majority respects the minority, and also people who are different from you. Well, this is the events in Holland. Let's now move to a historical framework, because I would like to take a step backwards and try to put things in a larger perspective. Normally, I would have asked my students to tell me, what do these numbers mean to you? But right now, of course, I cannot ask this question. So I will elucidate what these numbers mean by going to the first step, and that is 33, the Christ, his death, and Pentecost, the start of the church, and this coincides with the Roman Empire. So the church grew in the Roman Empire. It was, of course, persecuted, and a minority church with great diversity. And then what happens next is, of course, Constantine the Great stops the persecutions, and quite soon afterwards it becomes a state church, which has great consequences, whether it's good, whether bad, that's not for me to judge. It's simply a fact that it had great consequences. Well, if we now move to the next date, 451, that's the Council of Chalcedon, and I take this as a starting point for what one could say are more ethnic churches, or later on ethnic churches. And then I refer to the Armenian church, the Coptic church, the Syriac church, which are very much tied to a country or rather a language. So become, so to speak, state, very much tied to also an ethnic identity. To take a step further, of course, the Roman Empire, the East Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire falls, and actually it is succeeded by the Ottoman Empire. But one could look upon the Ottoman Empire as a continuation of the Roman Empire, Byzance après la Byzance, as it's sometimes said, as a multi-ethnic state. So this continues, and then, of course, the question is, where does Russia come in? Because Russia is of course starting to grow, as we know from history, a gathering of the land, and it receives what we could say is also like a state church. At an early stage, there is the ideal of Symphonia, but especially after Peter the Great, or Peter the First, as the Russians say, it's completely subjected to the state. There's not even a patriarch anymore. And this has great consequences. And I think these consequences one can see today as well. The church not daring to speak out against the state. Well, then the question now is, of course, what does this mean for the present situation and the war that is going on? And then I would like to draw your attention to the following picture. And this is Lenin, a statue of Lenin being reinstated in the parts of Ukraine that have been invaded. And this is not only in one place, but in several places. And one also sees Soviet flags. And I think this is significant because the churches are being bombed, but the symbols of the Soviet state are being reinstated. So the question is, has the Soviet state ever really, did it really die, or does it still live on in the minds of people, not only in Putin, but in the minds of a lot of other people, and nostalgia going back to the Soviet empire. And this brings me to the question, did the Russian Orthodox Church ever really fill the ideological void which was there already before the Soviet Union fell, or was it actually only a veneer, and has it not really taken root? I, as a priest, I wonder in how much Christianity has taken root again in Russia. And this brings me to the final sort of slide, where you see the Soviet Empire not actually ended. And this brings me to my final observation, and I can concur with what Kristina was saying. In how far is what Patriarch Kirill is saying, does this have anything to do with Christianity? Is he just being serving the needs of his president? And actually, this whole ideology looks to me more like a concoction of a mix of nationalist rhetoric and the culture war and the pagan notion of family values that is being imported from the terrible West, from the US. So this ideology, is this how Christian is it? Well, I would like to end with this question. So thank you for your attention. And sorry, it was a bit longer than 10 minutes.
Thank you, Michael, for this interesting overview of both the Dutch situation and its context within the wider church-state relations, especially in Russia, and maybe in the remains of the Soviet Union. Christianity has a history of being linked to political power in all kinds of ways. So in that sense, Kirill is perhaps less un-Christian than we might like to see, but nevertheless, I think these are important questions to pose and to think about. I'm very glad that we were able to give the floor also to Professor Alfons Brüning. He is the director of the Institute of Eastern Christian Studies in Nijmegen, and he also holds a chair at the Protestant University in Amsterdam on Orthodoxy and Peace Studies. Well, not necessarily in addition to that, but he is also quite well connected to the Ukrainian situation. So I look forward to his comments, maybe from a slightly more Ukrainian perspective than we've had so far with the first three speakers. Please, Alfons, take the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And I have to start by admitting that I have been asked to comment on the previous lectures somewhere earlier today, and I didn't listen to the or didn't have the opportunity to look on the lectures prepared for. So the actual birthplace of what I'm about to say is half an hour ago, or maximum 5 minutes ago. That might explain or might be an excuse for some shortcomings. So there is certainly much more to be distilled from the lectures we have seen and the papers we have listened to. I restrict myself to 4, well, questions and answers, or maybe I stop just halfway by giving an impulse and formulating a question. The first thing, sorry if that sounds more polemical than I actually intended to do, but it's just provocative in the sense of probably evoking further discussions, which will hopefully be fruitful. So first thing is, did we actually speak about religion so far? And I recall what Michael Bakker just said, how much religion is actually at stake in all these discussions. We heard about geopolitical narratives and systems like NATO in circulating Russia. We heard about more economical realpolitik narratives about natural resources or political influence. And also we heard about cultural wars, maybe political philosophical systems like political preferences of Putin and his entourage. So where's religion in all that? What we can perceive and what we can observe perhaps is that in all these front lines, religion is somehow integrated. We know as a general pattern from peace studies that very often, or to put it the other way, actual religious wars between religion, or for the purpose of mission or for the purpose of gaining territory, just for mission, just for religious influence, are an exception. What we have much more often is that wars are waged for very secular reasons, and that can be realpolitik or culture wars or political influence or even economic growth. But religion is used as a motivating source because it's much easier to motivate people and soldiers to fight for a sacred cause than it is for, say, control over oil and gas and some very secular things. So what is the role religion plays? It's actually integrated and in quite different manners in all these narratives which are now at stake in the Ukrainian-Russian war. Second point, and here I really would like to phrase the Ukrainian standpoint, because it's somehow noticeable, I think, is we talked a lot about Russia, but we didn't talk much about Ukraine. And that's what the Ukrainians are sometimes very discontent with, especially in the current situation. It's the term which they address is their subjectmas, is their being subject, not only the object, not only, as a classical term has, a borderland and battleground of different geopolitical, religious, and other narratives, but really having an identity of their own. So I wouldn't go that far that we unconsciously repeated Putin's era and neglect Ukraine, but very often there is the Ukrainian voice missing somehow, unintendedly perhaps. And I name that because there is not only the classical story of Holy Russia and its recent appearance in the Russian world, but there is also an Ukrainian version, which is called Kiev Christianity. But there is no such thing as Holy Ukraine. So Kiev Christianity is another narrative that is now being part of the national narrative of Ukraine, but it integrates religion in a different way, because Kiev Christianity consists of many churches and perhaps even of many Christian denominations. So it is by definition more open, more ecumenical, and distanced itself from the Muscovite ascetic and, as they want to see it, imperial version. I leave it with that because time is limited, but that gives us the possibility to see once again that religion can be integrated also in national narratives quite differently. And I think we are left with the question to more systematically analyze how religion can be integrated in larger systems, larger stories. In the sense, maybe there is actually, and we are faced with a war between two majority Orthodox countries. So it's not Orthodoxy against the West, it's not Christianity against Islam or something else, which we come across elsewhere. But we are also confronted with two versions of how to integrate religion into national, maybe political, maybe geopolitical narratives. One is more national imperial, perhaps, as it's recently said, and the other one, perhaps not by chance, a diaspora community, as is that of Father Michael Bakker, is also confronted with this in a more, say, in a way that addresses the conditions of Western society, the conditions of religious pluralism and the like. And maybe that somehow coincides also with Ukrainian realities of the last 30 years. And one final question, and I end up with it, but this is really a question I am struggling with, and perhaps many of us did, especially when reading Kirill's sermons, what has gone wrong? Because we should not cease to realize that even such stories as the Ruski Mir, the Russian world earlier on, and earlier on I mean just certainly until the end of 2021, could be treated as more soft power systems, as also with some other versions more integrative, which did not completely neglect Ukrainians' existence, which had also space. And I think the famous statement of Metropolitan Onufriy, who is the Metropolitan of the Moscow Patriarchate Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the second large one, if you want, calling the war just the same day when it started as fratricidal, as the sin of Cain murdering his brother Abel, is also a version of the Ruski Mir narrative, in the sense that there is a unity between several entities. All this has ceased. Yeah, so I think the great damage done is not only towards a more integrative, towards a more cultural version of be it Holy Russia, be it Ruski Mir or something, which is really difficult to discuss now. And I think the same devaluation also hits the traditional value narrative earlier on, so much promoted by Kirill and others. So we really are still struggling with the fact what has gone wrong that someone like Kirill and the Orthodox leadership in Moscow has so much subscribed to a narrative which is now mainly that of cultural wars. Of course, I share the, I'm with Father Michael Bakker by what is actually Christian in the sermons of Kirill, and how much does that have to do with religion. And what is also irritating, this is I'd like to add, is the inclination towards military strength and to kind of masculinity cults, and the cult of the Russian army that appears in recent days. That also is difficult to be reconciled with classical teaching of Orthodox Christianity about war and peace. In what way should be discussed? So that would be the impulses I took spontaneously from previous discussions, and I'm curious about further questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alfons. These were great comments, both upon what has been said and what has not been said. While maybe I can ask the speakers to at least put on their cameras again and then unmute also. Maybe in the meantime, we can all have a look at the questions remaining in the Q&A. But maybe there's many points I would like us to address in the remaining 25 minutes. But maybe one thing for Kristina and Alfons, the interesting thing about how Ukraine, on the one hand, has also this kind of fairly conservative Christian identity, and on the other hand, as Alfons rightly pointed out, I think also has a distinctly different conception of Christianity and Christianity in the national context, if only because of its diversity of churches, its diversity of Orthodox churches with their various allegiances, but also the presence of the Greek Catholic Church, and then Protestants and others that are around in larger numbers than in Russia. So maybe first Kristina, and then Alfons again, a bit more reflection on how what is the role of religion in Ukraine, and how do you look upon that?
So thank you for the question. It's very important to point out that the religious political situation in Ukraine is very different from Russia. And this is all the more striking if you consider that in 1991, so with the end of the Soviet Union, the two countries actually started from a rather similar position. And we have to remember that also in Russia, I'm not talking about Russia again, but it's important, the first constitution had a fairly liberal law on religious freedom that allowed for state recognition and free operation of many religious denominations. That law was turned back in 1997 and reverted to a state-controlled sort of monopoly of fewer religions, not only Orthodox, but also others. In Ukraine, a liberal law on a pluralistic practice of religion and the establishment of various religious denominations on the Ukrainian territory remained in place. And that's the very special aspect now about Ukraine, not only vis-a-vis Russia, but as an Orthodox country. So Ukraine is really the only majority Orthodox country where you have different Orthodox churches practicing. I mean, of course, that is connected with a lot of conflict between the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, now recognized by the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, that is now in part also debating its position as being of the Moscow Patriarchate, and the Greek Catholic Orthodox Church. So in that sense, yes, Ukraine is a special case.
Alfons, do you want to add on this?
Yeah, perhaps by means of illustration, just 2 points. Already during Soviet times, Ukraine has been called by many the Soviet Bible Belt for many reasons. And a large number, maybe not the majority, but really a large number also of the parishes of the current Moscow Patriarchate are by now situated in Ukraine, just in order to make clear what is at stake for them. Second point, or belonging to the first point, is we should realize that before World War II, many of the now western parts of Ukraine were still parts of Poland. So they didn't go through the entire persecutions, which is in a sense also Stalinist secularization, if you want, the persecutions of the Stalinist era, to the effect that many people, many religious communities remained there. They were then integrated into Russian Orthodoxy, also much to their dismay, but at the very least they could remain religious. So there are many reasons for ascribing a stronger role of religion in society to Ukraine in distinction from Russia. Just the Soviet secularization project was less successful for many reasons. And the second that sometimes somehow points to what Kristina already mentioned in her lecture, in her is that this dichotomy between conservative values, which could be illustrated by some of the points she mentioned, so family values, abortion, and maybe also home teaching and this kind of things. In Ukraine, we have the rather unique institution of the so-called All-Ukrainian Council of Religious and Churches and Religious Organizations, which is a common council entailing almost all religions. Though it's not ecumenical in the sense of the inter-Christian sense, it also contains representatives from Jews, Muslim communities, from I think there's also a small Buddhist community. So they all have, and with circulating seats, presided by sometimes the Jewish rabbi, sometimes by a Muslim, sometimes by representatives of the different churches. And so that could be kind of how to reconcile religious pluralism on the one hand, but among the first to issue a statement critical of the Istanbul Convention was exactly this forum. So that's the same, the same Maidan dichotomy. They all wanted to join Europe, but not exactly European LGBT rights. So this problem hasn't been solved. And there you could identify within any religion, you could identify quite diverged camps. So it's not like this plurality also within religion is really typical in Ukraine, but in this sense, as far as it is regarded inside the churches, I think you have a certain plurality also within Russian Orthodoxy, which of course is now completely leaving the scenery and is all somewhat forcefully homogenized.
Maybe while we think about other topics, Alfons, there's one question, I don't know whether you saw it, which is about the role of Christianity in the nationalism of Ukraine. Can you say a few words about that? Or do you say it doesn't play a role at all?
Well, the more nationalist, I put it briefly, and but so risking to be too less differentiated, I would say the more nationalist it gets, the less the role of religion. So you have patriotic narratives which somehow play with the also with the idea of a Kievan Christianity, but you never get as far as Holy Ukraine. Yeah, you have Holy Russia, but Holy Ukraine isn't existing. What you have is a kind of patriotic narrative that also integrates the idea of we have lived together with many religions. We have a Kievan Christianity which is distinct from Moscow which is devoutedly Orthodox, but it's distinct from Moscow in the sense that we prefer kind of ecumenical approach, that we cope with pluralism, also in the sense that our country has for centuries been inhabited by others, by Catholic Poles and Muslim Tatars, and you name it. And at the same time, it is more, say, erudite. It's more about scholarship. It's more about learning theology, different from the ascetic monastic tradition in Moscow. But this is not. It's on the second place. Yeah, first, it's not narrow-minded nationalistic. There is no Ukrainian Christianity going back to, I almost had said the Stone Age, but there was no Christianity. So there is a patriotic version, also very much fostered now by the newly created Orthodox Church of Ukraine. But this is, it's not defending Ukrainian Christianity, it's defending Ukraine. And as a subpart, a certain version of Christianity there.
Thank you. Maybe Evert, are there things you want to kind of comment on or contribute to the earlier discussions, or one of the questions that you want to highlight?
Yes, maybe two things. I think that the point that Alfons has made about, how did he put this? Did we actually speak about religion so far? I think that's a very good point, in the sense that, at least from the way I look at these issues, the question whether something is truly religious or not truly religious is not my primary focus. And I also, not being religious myself, I don't feel competent to say anything about that. What I'm interested in, and what I think is important in analyzing the current situation, or the way this conflict might develop, or how it may play out, is precisely the way, or the ways in which religion is used for a variety of purposes. And I would suggest that the idea of something like real religion or pure religion is one of those causes. So it's one of the objectives of some people to separate religion from the rest of society, to not engage in political theology and things like that, whereas other parties are precisely interested in developing something like political theology. And this, I think, is systematically blurring our perspective, if you like, or complicating it. Perhaps that's the better expression. That's one thing. And the other thing, which I made, a point I made in my presentation, but which was, I think, confirmed by all other three presentations, is that we are in fact dealing with several conflicts at the same time. We are dealing with the territorial ambitions and perhaps the imperial nostalgia of the Russian Federation, with its element of Soviet nostalgia, the idea of having to restore something. I think that reinstalling statues of Lenin, for example, is not so much about nostalgia for something like the Soviet system, but for this idea of being an empire and being a particular part of the world with recognizable symbols. It's about identity. It's not so much about society or politics, I think. Note that in Russia itself, Lenin has never disappeared. There were not massive statues anymore, but every local community, every small city, every provincial town has a Lenin statue, and usually on the central square. None of them have disappeared. What is interesting is that in the narrative about the Soviet past, that the Kremlin, at least until recently, has been spreading, and Putin in particular, is that Lenin was the villain. Lenin was the person who destroyed the Russian Empire, and Stalin had a hard time restoring it. So until recently, Stalin was the big hero and Lenin was the big villain, almost as villainous as Lev Trotsky. But what I find interesting in all of these contributions and in all these discussions is the other, or the conflict between the two conflicts going on. Because the other conflict, which is about the values and liberalism and gay pride and you name it, runs across all these countries. It also runs across Russia. And it's not limited to orthodoxy. So there's nothing exclusively Orthodox about this emphasis on family values and traditional values, because you find the same in Turkey, you find the same in Poland, you find the same in Hungary, and even China has joined this narrative at some point, and India has joined this narrative at some point. Yeah. So it's a global anti-Western, anti-liberal narrative, if you like. So it's not exclusively Orthodox, but it's also not essentially Orthodox, I think. And that goes in the direction of the plurality of positions that have been developed over the past decades in Orthodox churches, and have been suppressed in the case of the Russian Orthodox Church, but much less so in the case of other Orthodox churches. So I think that in the future we will see these two conflicts, if you like, we will see them separate. And even if the conflict around Ukraine or in Ukraine is somehow going to be resolved, the other one is going to stay for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Evert. Michael, can I ask you what you think about also the kind of what the ramifications are of exactly these both wars, in fact, the culture wars and the war kind of between the specific Russian-Ukrainian war for the Orthodox Church in Europe and maybe also the US, but especially Europe. What I mean, your particular parish has a particular position, but what do you think are the ramifications wider for Orthodoxy in Europe of these issues?
Well, thank you. Well, one thing is, of course, our parish, which has a tradition which is being looked at because it preserves something which has been lost. So the Suros tradition, which has been lost in other places, we're sometimes called the last Suros parish, with different nationalities working together. And actually, this was also the tradition of the Russian Church. But we, over the past 20 years, we saw what I could call the closing of the mind. No dialogue anymore, only condemning other people, not really interested in new positions. The theology is simply not very interesting. It's simply repeating what actually has been said in the 19th century. So this closing of the mind one sees in Russia. I think that Ukraine could be very interesting, because our parish is only a small island, and of course the war is terrible, but hopefully the war soon ends, and then I think the Ukrainian religious landscape will present us with very interesting cases, because there is the experience of plurality. We had this Easter. We had a priest over from north of Kiev who fled. His bishop is still a Moscow Patriarchate, but he says, I can't. So you see an interesting development, that the bishops don't dare to speak out, but the priests, they speak out. So I think now, of course, there is this pressure cooker, but there will be interesting developments, and maybe these different parts, and maybe even the Greek Catholics, they can come to a new ways of being a church. And the other thing is the experience of the diaspora, and the ones returning, they will have learned a lot about what goes on in Europe, and that we're not violating little children, that we also have families which we cherish, and that all these stories. Well, for instance, I live in Amsterdam. A lot of it is rubbish. These are let's say part of the ideology. So I'd say watch Ukraine. That may be very.
But do you think that this would have a ramification on Western Europe, on Orthodoxy in the UK and in the Netherlands and in Belgium, or do you think that?
Well, of course, well, there's something interesting going on, but of course it's now, because of the war, one does not see it. But the last 2 years, we see an influx of new people in the Orthodox Church, people with no background at all. So
converts from
converts, yes. With no sort of particular background. So there are very interesting things going on. And of course, there is this group of people who think, this is the only bastion where they don't have all these new things. And the real conservatives, well, sorry, I'd say then you're in the wrong place. In other cases, well, there is really this sort of marriage between ultra Catholic, ultra Orthodox, and ultra Protestant, which is going on. But there are other people who are simply very interested. So that's another development going on. So I don't think that maybe not so much to learn from, let's say, the East, that there is also a development in Europe itself, Western Europe, of diaspora, these different groups. But that's almost like returning to 2,000 years ago, when you had these small, diverse groups, minorities. So
let's see, Michael. Yeah. We're kind of nearing towards 8:30, and I think I'm looking at Kristina. Maybe there are some comments or things you want to add on the discussion to the discussion so far.
Yes, I want to come in on that last point of how the ideological conflict is really also one that we have all across our societies and in the West. And on the question of conversions, I want to share again in the chat a link to a very interesting study that just came out by an American colleague on conversions on the side of Russian Christian right to the Orthodox. And I mean, if you follow the debate on the American Christian right of what's happening in Ukraine, you see how hard it is for them. In a way, they don't want to let go of a certain idealization of that idealized picture of Russia as the great protector of traditional values and of Christians across the world. And they also think about the Russian intervention in Syria, which has given a lot of credit to Russia as a protector of Christians. And I really think that here we are in front of a new scenario. And what I see now is more a reluctance of Western actors on the right to let go of that Russia they have created. It's a bit like, when you stop a car in full speed, it takes a certain while until it actually stops. I think we are in this braking period, because I mean, honestly, the moral discredit in which Patriarch Kirill has maneuvered himself, I think, is enormous. And I think it's very hard to imagine that anybody will, close their eyes on that. So in ecumenical dialogue, in interreligious dialogue. But still, it's hard. And look at the Vatican. Also, the Vatican is really struggling to call things by the name. And that's actually a bit disappointing, I have to say.
Thank you, Kristina. Yes, these are, in that sense, very interesting times with lots of interesting studies coming out. So the book Kristina just shared by Sarah Ricari-Schwartz is indeed an interesting study on conversions and in the American context, and establishes this close link between the culture wars and the American right, and that is interesting work indeed. I'm just looking at the other panelists. Are there any kind of urgent remarks to make for now, closing off? There's always more to say.
Yes, there are many possible remarks, and
Yeah, exactly.
I think
Maybe we'll leave it at this.
many things have been said that are relevant to this topic. Maybe just to add to what Michael was saying, I think that this may very well be an important incentive for people in the Orthodox part of Christianity, or within several in the various Orthodox churches, to reorient themselves, and to we can expect enormous variety there, which already is, I think, in place, but to a certain extent dormant. I know from the Russian situation that it was already in place. There were enormous discussions. By the way, quite a few priests and parishes in Russia have protested against the war. We shouldn't forget that either, and with personal risk.
If
Thank you,
may
Evert.
add,
Yeah, Alfons. Yeah,
just adding to this, it's but by own science, I think we should not fall into the trap erected by Kirill, declaring this as a culture war. And what this war, the very possibility, we didn't think it was possible, but what the very fact of the outbreak has made clear, it has shifted coalitions. And what is now at stake is not so much the front line between conservatives and conservatives and liberals, or however you would like to label it, but it's the way we carry out this conflict, and the violence is not one of them. So we shouldn't have illusions that on the part of those Russian priests who spoke out against the war, there are many conservatives which would otherwise certainly not be prepared to organize gay pride parades. Yeah, but the way in which we discussed the topics with them, we thought could be different. We thought we could handle these conflicts in a, let's call it, civilized way, with refraining from violence. And so the application of violence has really created new conflict lines, and it's not between conservatives and liberals. These do exist, and still more, but the new conflict line is running, how would we actually carry out this conflict? How would we try to solve it? Yeah, not by victory or aggression, but just by consensus.
I think your remark, Alfons, ties in with the comment that Heleen Zorgdrager posted, Professor Zorgdrager, also from Radboud University in Amsterdam, who speaks, who reminds us of the fact that the end of the war, for the Ukrainians, of course, cannot be anything else than not becoming part of Russia and be free from a strong Russian influence. And that's something that thank you, Heleen, for reminding us of that, because indeed we can try and think of a time when this is over, but it can't be over if Ukraine is either in a low level war or is completely dominated by Russia.
Can't agree more.
Yeah. So thank you all very much for your comments, for your for the discussion, also the people who tuned in tonight, for your questions that you put, and that gave us some new and fresh thoughts on the topic. So I hope you will join further seminars organized by the KNAW. Thank you all for joining tonight, and see you soon in all other places wherever we may meet. Have a nice evening. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.